Please don't start the clock yet. The mic is backwards. Well, if that's the only question I have to answer, I don't need any of my time. 3 words. They deserve it. 1 word. Justice. The fact is, some people kill so cruelly, so callously, so wantonly, with such depravity, that they deserve to die, and we have an obligation to execute them. I am as certain of this as I am that my hand has 5 fingers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I feel certain. This is not abstract. This is not intellectual. This is intuitive, and yes, it's partly emotional, but it's real. There's so much more to the rational than that's real. Now, if you want more than just a 3-word answer, they deserve it, or a 1-word answer, justice, then here in a few minutes is a coherent account. I'll save most of my time for rebutting Bob Bohm. Every point that he made has a response. And the fact that you can number it and make it 22 or 24 separate reasons, when you really think about it, they come down to 4 or 5. And I'll get to that in the rebuttal. The past counts. Perpetually. It counts. The fact that we may get benefits, or the fact that we may have costs that exceed the benefits from the death penalty, is ultimately, for those of us who understand and feel certain that the past counts, it's ultimately irrelevant. The voice of your brother's blood cries out to you from the ground. So we don't engage in a cost-benefit calculus, those of us who are retributivist supporters of the death penalty. We look to the past. We don't ask the question, what good will it do? We ask the question, what bad has been done? And what is the only appropriate response to that? What is the only thing that we intuitively and emotionally know is fundamentally necessary to do justice, something that we embrace? 2 very different frameworks can be used to analyze this whole issue. One is a relativist, subjectivist framework. We do look at costs, we do look at benefits, we do look at public opinion, we ask, do the people want it? Is it less expensive? If the people want it and it's less expensive, if the benefits outweigh the costs, then do it, otherwise not. But the other, which, by the way, doesn't necessarily divide advocates and opponents of the death penalty, many of us unite on this, and my suspicion is, if you dig deeply enough into Bob Bohm, you will find that the utilitarian justifications for opposing the death penalty that he gave you ultimately disappear. And it really comes down to an intuitive understanding, a moral understanding, that there are certain moral facts. This is not just a matter of opinion ultimately. It's not just a matter of which way the majority comes. It's not just a matter of costs. It's not just a matter of benefits. There ultimately are moral facts. There is an objective reality to this. There is only one right answer to the question, is the death penalty ever deserved? And do we have an obligation to execute people? So we're committed to the past. We're committed to a reality that is greater than merely a cost-benefit calculus. We're committed to moral facts. We're invested with an emotional, intuitive connection to it. And we recognize that some people kill with such cruelty, such callousness, such wantonness, that they deserve to die, and we have an obligation to execute them. Now, we have other ancillary obligations that go along with that. We have the obligation as a retributivist to distinguish between those who deserve it and those who don't. If you are retributivists, and my suspicion is that most of you are, be aware you must be just as committed to making sure that those who don't deserve it don't get it as you are that those who do. Which means you must agitate for a morally refined death penalty. Bob Bohm points out, and he points out correctly, that only a small fraction of the death eligibles actually are executed. And he points out correctly that some who should die, like the Green River killer, did not. Of course, that's a very odd justification for not killing those others who do deserve to die. And the reason that the Green River killer was spared, and he shouldn't have been, but the reason that he was spared ultimately was because the price of sparing him was to put to rest tens of killings which they could not pin on him, and the locations of some bodies and bones at this point which they couldn't otherwise locate, and so he made the trade. And yes, there's a deep irony of injustice to that. Shaw once said, if a person steals money from one little old woman, he lands in jail. If he steals money from 100,000 little old women, he lands in Parliament. And there's a truth to that. And there's a truth to that. There are various standards of justice, and the rich and powerful do get a separate standard. You need not convince me of that. I prosecuted official corruption and became intensely aware of it. But don't lose focus. The question is, does anybody deserve to die? And once you know that there is only one moral answer to that, and the answer is yes, the next question is, do we have the obligation to execute them? Again, the answer is yes. The next question is, can we revise and morally refine death penalty statutes so that we do get to the worst of the worst in rough approximation, and then leave it to successive filtration systems to winnow out those who most deserve to die? The answer is yes. And do we have the guts to do it? The answer is maybe, and we'll see. As I said, everything that he has said can be rebutted, and I'll spend the bulk of my time doing it. But for now, I close as I open. Why? 3 words. They deserve it. 1 word. Justice.
They deserve it. The fact of the matter is that most capital offenders deserve to be punished. They deserve to be punished severely. But they don't need to be executed. Execution says a lot about us. Does a civilized society need to exterminate its citizens, those citizens who commit the worst, the most heinous crimes? And the answer to that question is unquestionably no. The fact of the matter is that there are 14, actually 19 jurisdictions in the United States that are able to achieve justice, that are able to achieve incapacitation, that are able to achieve retribution without resorting to capital punishment. 125 nations in the world are able to achieve those same goals without capital punishment, without executions. And those countries and those states don't seem to be any worse for not imposing the death penalty. No calamities have occurred in non-death penalty jurisdiction that made them reimpose the death penalty. Indeed, the trend worldwide is abolition of the death penalty, not reinstatement. 40 nations in the world have abolished the death penalty since 1990. None of them, no nation in the world, has reinstated the death penalty. Now, I think it's important for us to distinguish between 2 things here. One is the death penalty in theory, how we would like to deal with criminals in an ideal and utopian world. And perhaps in such a world, we could, as Professor Blecker has argued, distinguish the worst of the worst. There is no evidence today that we can do it in reality, but perhaps in the ideal we might be able to do that. We've got to distinguish between theory and practice, because in theory we might actually be able to achieve retributive goals with the death penalty. But in practice, we certainly can't. I've listed 24 reasons of why the death penalty in practice achieves no discernible goals of justice, of incapacitation, of deterrence, or of retribution that could not be achieved with an alternative, non-death penalty sentence. Professor Blecker argues that we should feel the death penalty emotionally, that we should impose the death penalty for emotional reasons. I disagree. I think that the taking of a human life by the state should be based on reason and not emotion. We should have a very good reason for doing so, and not simply because we feel that it's right. People who support the death penalty in this country, the evidence shows, do not support it for some lofty philosophical retributive reason. People support the death penalty in this country for vengeance. Raw, vindictive vengeance. And as Justice Marshall noted in his Furman opinion, vengeance cannot be tolerated in a civilized world. We cannot provide a fair and just capital punishment system. We have been trying to do that for the last 30 years, and we have failed miserably. We must give up the effort and join the 14 jurisdictions in this country and the 125 countries throughout the world that have already realized what eventually we will realize one day, that we do not need the death penalty. Thank you.
All right, now it's time. First of all, the rough equation or easy equation of retribution and vengeance, or retribution and revenge, is simply false and fallacious. They are not the same, though they spring from a common source, which is the desire to inflict pain and suffering on those who inflict pain and suffering on us. Because if retribution is simply revenge, then deterrence, as Hobbes pointed out, is simply terror and terrorism. Retribution requires that punishment be limited, proportional, and directed. Revenge makes no such requirement. It need not be limited, it need not be appropriately directed, and it need not be proportional. No philosophical, lofty goal moves us. It's not abstract. Robert Cooey broke into Jessica Lunsford's house. She was 9 years old, as you know. She was sleeping in her bed. He took her out of her bed and kidnapped her, took her to his house, kept her captive for days, sexually abusing her, then raped her, then put her in plastic bags and buried her alive, where she suffocated, trying to claw her way out. That's not an abstract question. That's a very concrete question. Does he deserve to die, as 10 of 12 Florida jurors said? Yes, he most certainly does. Am I certain? Yes. Am I abstractly certain? Yes, but that's irrelevant. Am I emotionally certain? Yes, and that's entirely relevant. Now, point by point, if I could only read it, his statements, Bohm's statements. First, there is, quote, no evidence, first slide, there's no evidence of any marginal deterrent effect. Well, he really meant there's no sufficient evidence to satisfy him. because to rebut that, I only have to give you some evidence. And I can give you evidence on several levels, but let me give you a piece quickly. Let's call him Joe, because his name was Joe, who I spoke with at length inside Lorton Prison. And Joe told me a story about going to a house where he believed there were 3 kilos of cocaine to rob the drug dealers. And he was right, there were, but there were also several kilos of heroin. Surprise, surprise, what good luck. So he duct taped the drug dealers, sent the rest of his cohort outside, and was preparing to kill them. But he didn't. I asked him why not. And he said because what went through his head at that moment were his days in the Richmond Penitentiary when he used to sweep the halls and look at the electric chair where they executed the Briley brothers, and that he couldn't stand the thought of his being strapped to that chair and being executed, so he let them live. Now that was very interesting because that's first direct primary evidence that in fact the death penalty deterred, but it doesn't prove that it marginally more effectively deters than life without parole. Bohm is a very careful scholar, and he said marginally more effectively deters, because that's the issue. Of course the death penalty deters, but so does life. It doesn't always deter, but neither does life. So the question is, does it more marginally deter? Well, so then I asked Joe, do you ever have any similar circumstance in Washington, D.C., which has no death penalty? And he said yes, as a matter of fact. They had broken into a house. That's what he specialized in. It's a high-risk occupation, robbing drug dealers. Of course, the good news is they don't go to the cops. The bad news is that they take care of it themselves. So he broke into Washington, D.C., and again, in a big drug score. And what did he do? He killed them. Why? I asked him. He said, because I know what the D.C. system is like. I've been here before, and I know I can handle what they have for me. That is direct primary evidence. It's an anecdote. It's a datum of 1. That's true. But to say that there's no evidence is absurd. Human nature is such that everything we have we will give for our life. Common sense is such. The last 6 studies, which are controversial, albeit, but they are very sophisticated, the last 6 very sophisticated economic studies show a marginally more effective deterrent rate. The abolitionists have started to counter them. It's an open question, but it is hardly what was suggested. That's 1. 2, costs. He cites Kansas 2003. Of course, he neglects to tell you that Kansas was one of the few studies which, even in footnote, and only in his book in footnote, by the way, does it acknowledge that what they fail to take into account in their cost studies when they show how much more expensive the death penalty is than life without parole is the hundreds of thousands of dollars saved for every guilty plea extracted where someone agrees to accept life without parole in lieu of a trial and a possible death sentence. Nobody forgoes the investigation costs, the trial costs, and the appellate costs and accepts life without parole, except when there's a threat of death in the death penalty. You never take it. You might as well go to trial and you might as well appeal it. Every person who pleads guilty and accepts life without parole, virtually every person, does so only in a death penalty jurisdiction and only to avoid the death penalty. Those costs saved are enormous. They have never been subtracted by any study. Kansas at least had the good sense to acknowledge it in footnote. Bohm in his book has the good sense to acknowledge it in footnote. However, live he did not tell you about that. Third, the death penalty, he says, is arbitrary, that it's nothing more than a lottery. Now that's not true, and I've covered it a little bit. It is not nothing more than a lottery, though I do readily concede it is far from perfect. It is far from sufficiently narrowed. It is way too broad. I am no apologist for the present death penalty regime. The statutes fail to get some who deserve to be gotten, but more importantly, they sweep up many who do not deserve it. The single most important change we can make is to abolish the robbery aggravator for the felony murder, specifically the robbery aggravator that makes you death eligible. Because you rob from a pecuniary motive, which you almost always do when you rob, does not mean that you kill from a pecuniary motive when the robbery goes bad. Robbery has put more people on death row than any other single aggravator, and probably as many as all others combined. It must be, it should be eliminated. Another one that should be eliminated is the one that says if you're a lifer and you kill again, you should be death eligible. That's, and the theory is, if you've killed and you're serving life, there's nothing more we can threaten you with. As he points out in his book, Death Quest, and he's absolutely right, everybody who's experienced with the criminal justice system in prisons will tell you that that lifers have the most to lose, not the least to lose. You can threaten to withdraw things they care about very much, their privileges. And if I had more time, I would tell you a story of a lifer who I got to know who had someone killed under a set of circumstances that clearly did not mean that he deserved to die. So I'm one with him on that, in that the death penalty statutes today need to be morally refined. It's not a lottery, as he suggests, but it does have a failure in it so far to adequately separate the worst of the worst. Next, the state variation. Well, what does that prove? It proves that we are a society committed today to the same essential principle we were committed to in 1788 when we ratified the United States Constitution, and that is essentially federalism. That the people of each state have the right, and that it is essentially a state function to define, detect, prosecute, and punish crime. It is not primarily a federal function. The feds have moved in, and in my view, wrongly, to supplant death penalties in states that don't have them. It is for each state to decide for itself. If you start quarreling about state diversity, as he is, I would ask him, is he willing to move to a situation of state uniformity in which we do it one way across the United States? Yes, of course he is, as long as the one way is no way. But if it's to reflect the majority opinion in the United States, the one way would be a uniform death penalty across the United States. I know that would not make him happy. It makes no abolitionist happy. What you are seeing is an instance of federalism. Now, there is, as he suggests, county variability within each state. That's a much more complicated matter. It involves some of the same principles. If one county has a set of values that significantly differ from another county, though they are now under a uniform criminal law or criminal code, as it is in the state, whereas the state criminal codes differ state by state, should there be county variability that operates supposedly under one code? Well, one answer would be to say no, and we can take care of that. Some states have a central system of deciding who gets it, as the federal government does. It has to go through the Justice Department. On the other hand, prosecutors are elected county by county. So they have different values, their constituents have different values, they have different assessments of success or failure, they have different assessments, that is, whether they can get it, they have different budgets as to whether they can sustain it, they have different projections as to whether the juries will give it, and they have different value systems as to whether the defendants may deserve it. So it's a deep and difficult question, not easily resolved, how we reconcile at once a commitment to federalism and the variability and the families, that in fact, insofar as the families of the victims have a significant say as to whether there's going to be a death penalty, whether the prosecutors will move forward, and insofar as almost all killings are same-race killings, whites killing whites or blacks killing blacks, and insofar as blacks tend to have a more nuanced view and a deeper understanding of the street conditions that produce many of these killings, many of the black victims' families, when consulted, understand that there but for fortune, my child, instead of being the dead victim, could have just as easily been the defendant. And so rather than compound the tragedy, they say, no, we would prefer that you not go for the death penalty. And insofar as their voices are listened to, as the families of the victims, that does not in any way show that we are disparaging black life, or they are. That shows that they are continuing to value black life, including the life of the killer. And furthermore, all the contemporary studies show that there is no race of victim effect within any county. That is to say, take any county you want, and the killer of a black victim is no less likely to die than the killer of a white victim within the county. The entire race of victim effect can be explained, as all the recent studies have shown by Baldus and Bohm and others. The entire race of victim effect ultimately collapses into a geography effect. And then we get to I could go on, the religious organizations are opposed to it, yes, but the religious people are in favor of it. You see, that's part of the elitism. Let me take that one for a second. We hear about all the countries who abolished it, and he proudly says, I can't believe he's proud of it. He says about the EU, that's a reason to abolish the death penalty, because the EU requires you to abolish the death penalty as a criterion. That's why European countries are abolishing it. It's economic coercion, it's blackmail. I spoke in Geneva at the Parliament, and I was the only proponent there, so they ignored me. And they were proudly proclaiming, look at what we've done. We've coerced other countries to abolish the death penalty, like Turkey, because that was the price of admission. The last public opinion polls I saw, 81% of Japan supported it, 77% of Poland supported it, 65% of Russia, 63% of Mexico, 62% of Slovakia, 57% of the Czech Republic, and probably Peter Hodgkinson conceded, he's the head of the Death Penalty Center of Studies at the University of Westminster, he conceded in public debate that probably 70% of the Brits support it. What's going on here is elitism. It's the governments of Europe who oppose it. It's the people of Europe who support it. It's the people of the United States who support it. We are one with them in values. The only difference is, And the explanation of why we're the only Western democracy with the death penalty is because we're the only Western democracy who's acting like a Western democracy. The rest of them are acting, imposing, the elites imposing their views on the people. That's as true of the religious elites as it is of the political elites. This is all about elitism. And so, again, I guess my time has run out too at this point. But the point to end with, once again, is Bob Bohm's statement that it is not necessary for retribution. Look at all the states that don't have it. And I ask you to search your own souls, and you tell me, if Robert Cooey went into Jessica Lunsford's house, that 9-year-old, and took her out of her bed and kidnapped her and raped her and then buried her alive, and happened to do it in an abolitionist state, and instead spends his life in prison, which we'll get to in the next part, and spends his life in prison, can you tell me that justice would have been done? Can you tell me that retribution would have been served? I feel certain it would not. My guess is that most of you feel certain it would not.